South Korea's benchmark stock index lost 3,900 points in 2 months, dropping from an all-time high of 9,000 to 5,500, and took ordinary citizens' home deposits down with it. I am Lambert Woollingham, and this is the Daily Shear for Friday, August 14th. It is the kind of day where the paperwork outpaces the plot, so let us get into it. Closer to home, the friction is structural this morning. Wirings, ballots, and school ratings, all failing in ways that finally required someone official to notice. A Harris County judge has ordered the owners of the Palms on Rolling Creek Apartments to fix a list of hazards that reads like a building inspector's fever dream. Globix Palms Rolling LLC now has 30 days to hire licensed electricians, check for structural deficiencies, and install smoke detectors that actually work, after years of tenant complaints and one sheriff's deputy getting shocked while inspecting a breaker box. The complex will keep operating throughout the repairs, so residents get to live inside the fix. A separate small claims suit accuses management of demanding months of rent up front to cover its own payroll, then turning around and billing the same tenant for thousands in back rent. Other tenants say they have been locked out of their own units after reporting power failures, which is one way to handle a maintenance request. Austin Bergstrom is getting its first non-stop flight to Paris, with Delta launching daily Charles de Gaulle service in March of 2027 on an Airbus A330. The route rounds out the airport's European lineup alongside London, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt, and connects travellers into the Air France and KLM networks beyond. It did not happen by accident. The city waived 2 years of landing fees and kicked in up to $500,000 in marketing money funneled through the Opportunity Austin Development Group. City leaders are framing daily flights to Paris as essential infrastructure, which is a phrase that used to mean roads. In McKinney, a group of voters has filed recall paperwork against the mayor and 3 city council members, 1 week after the council unanimously approved a mosque and Islamic centre. Organisers insist the timing is a coincidence and that the real complaints are about spending, growth, and transparency. They now have 45 days to collect physical signatures equal to 30% of the last municipal elections turnout, with a floor of 1,000 names regardless of how the math works out. The committee's designee says this is about restoring accountability, which is the same thing every recall committee designee says. The Fifth Circuit has reinstated Texas's mail-in ballot ID requirements, tossing out a lower court injunction on the grounds that the civil rights groups suing over it could not prove enough of their own members would actually be disenfranchised. Under the law, male voters have to supply a state ID number or the last 4 digits of a social security number that matches their registration exactly, with no room for a typo. The plaintiffs argued the mismatch rate would hit older voters and voters of colour hardest, and that they had had to divert resources just to explain the new hoops to people. The court was not moved, and the ruling also keeps in place tighter poll watcher access and stiffer penalties for helping someone vote. All of it takes effect with the November elections closing in. Austin Independent School District is facing a possible state takeover after Burnett and Webb Middle Schools each pulled their 5th consecutive F from the Texas Education Agency, which is the number that triggers state intervention by law. Commissioner Mike Morath can now dissolve the elected school board and install his own managers or close the campuses outright and send in a conservator. The irritating part, from the district's perspective, is that Austin ISD earned a B rating overall for the first time in 4 years, with 61 campuses landing an A or a B. Dobie Middle School dodged its own 5th F by scraping out a D. The district has already replaced both principals and plans to appeal by September. So the state's decision waits on that outcome. On the economic side, the numbers get bigger and the accountability gets vaguer, starting with a White House report on exactly how much money the country claims it is not collecting. The White House says a shadow network spanning more than 40 countries is helping Chinese exporters dodge United States tariffs at a cost the administration pegs between $19 and $26 billion a year. Trade advisor Peter Navarro's report, titled The Great Transshipment Scam, alleges goods get routed through places like Mexico, Canada, the European Union, and Southeast Asia, where light assembly or a new shipping label is enough to launder their country of origin before they hit American shelves. The administration says this has quietly flattered the official United States-China trade deficit while gutting domestic manufacturing in integrated circuits, aluminum, and motor components. The White House is now promising to deploy artificial intelligence to cross-reference shipment data and to punish any trading partner caught facilitating the workaround. No word yet on what happens when the AI flags a discrepancy nobody wants to explain. Central banks around the world are raising interest rates again, undoing a year of forecasts that promised the opposite. Australia kicked off the tightening cycle in February, Norway followed in May, and the European Central Bank and Bank of Japan both hiked in June, with New Zealand adding its own increase in July. The common culprits are supply chain disruption, tariff uncertainty, and energy prices spiking out of the Iran conflict. And US inflation is still sitting at 3.5% as of June. The Federal Reserve is now under pressure to fall in line with everyone else, which would mean pricier mortgages, car loans, and business credit here at home. It is worth noting this is the same artificially cheap money era finally presenting its bill several years late and with interest. California regulators have signed off on Charter Communications' $34.5 billion purchase of Cox Enterprises, clearing the last hurdle for a merger that makes Charter's Spectrum brand the largest internet and cable provider in the country, ahead of Comcast. The deal hands Spectrum dominant control of Southern California, swallowing Cox customers from Santa Barbara down to San Diego. To get the California Public Utilities Commission's blessing, Charter agreed to consumer protections, infrastructure investment targets, and broadband expansion into underserved areas spread across 2 settlement agreements. Charter's executives are calling it a transformative alignment that will deliver savings to consumers, which is the traditional thing a newly dominant company says on its way to becoming more dominant. The review took 15 months, and the deal closes next week. President Trump has slapped a 100% tariff on a wide category of imported drones and aircraft parts, targeting anything with thermal imaging, anything over 25 kilograms, and all components above that same weight. The White House is framing it as a national security move aimed squarely at Shenzhen-based DJI and China's grip on the drone market, building on existing federal bans on foreign-made drones, routers, and robotics for government use. In practice, it doubles the cost of the heavy survey, agricultural, and logistics drones that American farms and businesses have been buying cheap for years. Operators are now stuck choosing between a much bigger bill or a domestic startup that may or may not exist yet at the scale they need. The tariff takes effect immediately. South Korea's stock market just lived through one of the sharpest corrections in its history, with the Kospi index falling from an all-time high of 9,000 points in mid-June to 5,500 within weeks, before settling near 6,800. Analysts are comparing the speed of the collapse to the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic crash, which is not a comparison anyone wants attached to their portfolio. The trigger was a sudden wave of doubt about the enormous spending required to keep the artificial intelligence boom running, which sent institutional investors fleeing semiconductor and hardware stocks. SK Hynix alone lost half its value from its recent peak, and a huge share of South Korea's retail trading class had poured savings, including home deposits, directly into that chip narrative. Elsewhere, the day ranges from a courtroom precedent to a lake in Zimbabwe, so we will take it roughly in order of how much of it you can do anything about. A New York City police officer has been convicted of felony strangulation, the first successful prosecution under the city's 2020 chokehold ban. Officer Omar Habib was found guilty of choking a man unconscious during a 2023 arrest at a catering hall and is being held without bail by order of a Bronx Supreme Court judge. Prosecutors showed Habib compressed the man's airway hard enough to stop his breathing and circulation, and internal records surfaced a substantiated chokehold complaint from 2017, along with an evidence tampering allegation that had already sunk one gun case back in 2016. The conviction triggers automatic termination and carries up to 7 years. The police union has called the verdict proof that officers now risk prison for doing their jobs. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt is stepping down at the end of the month, less than 3 months before the midterms, with the administration citing her wish to spend more time with her young children. Leavitt spent her tenure as a combative public defender of the president, regularly sparring with the press corps and functioning as one of Trump's most visible surrogates. No successor has been named, and officials are reportedly weighing whether to leave the podium empty and let communications director Stephen Chang absorb the job, possibly straight through the midterms. A few cable news names are being floated, but nothing looks imminent. The West Wing's messaging operation now heads into election season without its lead messenger. The Kennedy Center's board has voted to close the main building for a $250 million renovation and permanently put Donald Trump's name on the facade 3 months after a federal judge blocked an earlier version of the same plan. The board, largely handpicked by the administration, is keeping a newer wing called the Reach open for limited programming, which will also serve as the active memorial to President Kennedy while the rest of the building sits dark. Trustees now have to present the full plan to the same federal judge within the week, effectively daring the court to unwind a renovation already scheduled. The unresolved legal fight has left the country's flagship performing arts venue unable to book anything long-term. In Zimbabwe, the death toll from a ferry that capsized on Lake Kariba has reached 46, with 77 survivors pulled from the water and search crews still working. Survivors say the boat, built to carry 90 people, was loaded with an estimated 153, and that the captain kept going despite pleas to turn back as waves battered the hull. The vessel was one of the only transport links between the town of Kariba and rural fishing camps where roads have effectively stopped existing. There is no official passenger manifest, so authorities still cannot say with certainty who was actually on board. The disaster has set off public anger over years of unregulated ferry traffic and a rescue response residents describe as too slow. A 6th straight day of storms has turned parts of the Midwest into a disaster zone, with Indiana under a state of emergency after rainfall meteorologists are calling a 1-in-1,000-year event. Governor Mike Braun has called out the National Guard for water rescues as the White River crested at a record 24 feet, and hundreds of thousands remain without power. Ohio's governor ordered evacuations as rivers breached their banks into residential neighborhoods, on top of damage from an earlier derecho that flattened trees and knocked out infrastructure across the region. Fatalities include a child killed by a falling tree and a resident killed when a house exploded during the storms. Rescue crews are still clearing flooded roads as the same system pushes into central Illinois. I keep coming back to the Kennedy Center, keeping one wing open specifically to serve as the active memorial to President Kennedy, while the rest of the building goes dark for a renovation that ends with someone else's name on the door. That is a very specific kind of arrangement. The memorial gets a corner, the facade gets a rebrand, and everyone involved gets to say the tribute is still technically ongoing. I assume the tour guide script now includes a line about how the gift shop is temporarily relocated, but the legacy remains fully intact. Give it a few more renovation cycles, and the reach will be the size of a broom closet with a very good plaque. I would ask what Kennedy would think of it, but at this point that is a question for the wing, not the building. Nobody at the Kennedy Center has explained what happens to bookings already scheduled for the wing that is not closing, and I suspect the answer is that nobody has asked yet either. That is the inventory for today. I am Lambert Woollingham, and my breaker box, unlike some in North Harris County, remains fully operational. The day has been shorn. Until tomorrow.